The Many Deaths of Harry Potter, written by ShayneT. Chapter 12. It wasn't as easy as just learning to wave his wand a certain way. Apparently there was a lot more to casting spells than Harry had thought. Part of the reason the school presented it in a slow fashion was so that students could understand what it was that they were doing. He struggled, even with the help of Woods and Pusey, neither of whom knew about each other. Woods was a demanding taskmaster, a perfectionist who seemed to love to make long and boring speeches. Despite that, he seemed to know what he was talking about. "It's better to have one spell that you know very well than a half-dozen you can barely cast," he told Harry early on in training. "If you can figure out unusual ways to use that spell, you're even better off." He tried to help Harry cast spells, but focused more on teaching him to dodge them. Apparently, dodging was an important part of wizard combat, especially since there was no shield that would stop an Avada Kedavra. Harry had to practice dodging for increasingly long periods while trying to cast spells back at the other person. Wood only taught him to use Expelliarmus and Stupefy. Pusey also taught him the stinging hex on the principle that causing pain to the bullies was the only way to get them to stop. It took time, even to get the casting of those right frustrating time that made Harry wonder what he was doing. He was supposed to fight Voldemort, so shouldn't he be some kind of prodigy? Both of his tutors assured him that he was learning quickly for a first year, although Harry was suspicious that they were just humouring him. Even once he began to cast the spells, they weren't very powerful. His stinging hex hurt less than a slap to the face, and his Stupefy only dazed his tutors for a moment. Worse, even if he got the spell to work right, he still needed to hit his target, and both of his tutors excelled in a sport that required dodging. With time, the spells got better, although it never seemed to be enough against the older boys. It all felt like an exercise in futility, until he managed to catch Cormac McLaggen in the face with a stinging hex after the 5th time he tried to catch him in the halls in a week. Woods had demanded to learn where he'd learned that spell. Harry claimed he was practicing it on his own. The Slytherins bullied him occasionally, although they were usually less blatant than the Gryffindors and much less likely to get caught. Hermione and Neville took to staying close to him during classes they had together and while moving to and from class. They tried to head off the bullies wherever they could, even though Harry could see that it made Neville anxious. He reassured Neville that courage wasn't about not having fear. It was about acting in spite of fear. The irony of a Slytherin lecturing a Gryffindor on the nature of courage wasn't lost on either of them. Hermione tried to complain about the abuse to McGonagall, but she seemed to think that Harry's head of house should handle the situation. Strangely, Harry began to wonder if Snape was actively avoiding him. He saw him interact more with other students, even if those interactions were usually negative, but he mostly let Harry alone. Sometimes he would stare at Harry in class and then turn away with an uncomfortable look on his face. Harry had no idea what that was about. Quirrell kept up the ruse of being a perfectly normal teacher, although Harry became more and more convinced that he was up to something. Wood cast a disillusionment charm on him after each practice, but it was up to Harry to get to him without being seen. He took to meeting with Hermione and Neville in the library and then leaving them shortly before he was to see Wood. With Pusey it was easier. They could meet in the dungeons, and the one time they were almost caught, Pusey hit Harry in the face with a jinx that made his entire face swell for several hours. Harry heard some of the other members of the Quidditch team congratulating him for that one. Pusey didn't even bother to apologize later. It was part of the deal, after all. Objectively, Wood was better than Pusey. He was a 5th year after all, while Pusey was only a 3rd year. Pusey, however, was willing to teach Harry to fight dirty. Yet Harry found himself valuing his relationship with both boys for more than just the training. Wood was firm but fair, and Harry sometimes imagined that he would have liked to have had an older brother just like him. Pusey had a sharp wit. He had a dry sense of humour and a way of looking at things that Harry had never thought of before. Sometimes Wood seemed almost affectionate toward him, and Pusey was guardedly friendly. Harry would have loved having Wither attitude from his aunt and uncle. He'd craved affection from anyone, and even though both boys were somewhat reserved around him, it was more affection than he'd ever had in his entire life. Compared to the training Harry was receiving from the older boys, it surprised him how slowly they were in learning real spells in class. The school seemed to be more concerned with creating a foundation for the understanding of how to cast spells than in actually casting spells. He'd been working with his two mentors for a month before Flitwick's class learned how to levitate a feather. The wand work he'd learned made the task easier, although he still wasn't first in the class. It was close, though, and Harry suspected that if he kept working, he might eventually be the top of his class. He got better with transfiguration, although they still only worked with small objects that were similar to each other. Transfiguration was still slow for him, as it was for everyone else in the class. It required a lot of imagery and getting every detail perfect. The levitation spell seemed useful enough, and Harry could practice it on his own, unlike the spells he had been learning. On the day of October 31st, the day they learned to levitate feathers, Harry went to meet with Neville and Hermione in the library, only to learn that Hermione wasn't coming. Apparently, Ron had said something that upset her, and she was in the girls' bathroom crying. Harry didn't know how to deal with a crying girl, so he tried to put it out of his mind. She'd stop crying eventually, and then he'd deal with her when she was back to being rational. It was the only sensible way to deal with things. However, as the afternoon progressed, Hermione didn't show up for flying lessons. It was unlike Hermione to miss classes. Given her nature, that meant that whatever had happened had hurt her greatly. Harry began to feel guilty. Hermione was one of only 2 friends that Harry had made, someone who had faced the wrath of the entire school to be friends with him. Part of it might have been that she wasn't making friends in Gryffindor, but Harry suspected that was in large part because of her association with him. Neville sometimes hinted that they were being pressured to end their friendship with him, but Hermione never said anything. When she still hadn't shown up in time for dinner, he decided to find her. After making sure that Quirrell was at the high table, as well as locating his most frequent bullies, Harry slipped away from dinner. He'd managed to grab a few things from the feast and slip away. Hermione hadn't eaten lunch, and he assumed she'd be hungry. He found the bathroom on the 3rd floor, and he called out cautiously, "Hermione!" The sounds of sobbing could be heard from inside. He wondered how she'd had the energy to cry for so long. On the occasions he'd been able to cry, he'd always worn himself out in short order. "Go away," she said. "You can't be in here. This is the girls' loo." Harry hesitated. "Well, I'm a Slytherin, so I'm probably not good at following the rules." "Just because you're a Slytherin doesn't mean you don't have to follow the rules," Hermione said, her voice outraged. As Harry stepped cautiously into the lavatory, he noticed that Hermione was sitting with her back against the wall. Her face was red and her eyes were swollen from crying. "I don't really care about rules," Harry said, "but I do care about you. What happened?" Hermione stared at the floor in front of her. "I don't want to talk about it." "All right," Harry said. "What?" she asked, startled. "If you don't want to talk about it, I'm not going to make you," Harry said. He held out a napkin. "I brought you a little something from the feast." Her nose crinkled. "I'm not going to eat in the loo. It's not hygienic." Harry shrugged. "Okay." He popped a roll into his mouth. "You shouldn't eat in the loo either," Hermione protested. "What's it going to do, kill me?" Harry asked. He smirked. "There's still time to go back to the feast and eat proper." Hermione scowled and looked back at her feet. "I don't want to." "Is Weasley being a prat again?" "Where did you hear about that?" Hermione asked sharply, looking up. "Weasley's always being a prat to you, as far as I can see," Harry said, "so it wasn't hard to guess." She was quiet for a long moment before she finally spoke. "He thinks I'm a traitor for spending time with you. He calls me a Slytherin in sheep's clothing." "Is that the worst thing?" Harry asked quietly. "Aren't you smart and ambitious just as much as you are brave? I dare say the hat could have probably put you in any of the houses if it had wanted. He says I would never have had any friends anyway if I hadn't met you and Neville, that I'm a busybody and a know-it-all." "Well, you are a know-it-all," Harry said, "which probably upsets some people who are know-nothings." "Am I a busybody?" Hermione asked quietly. Harry shrugged. "You care about people and you want to keep them safe. The thing is, people want to make their own mistakes. Not me, of course. I never want to make any mistakes." "That's why we get along?" "Well, it's not because you do my homework," Harry said. They weren't around each other often enough for that to happen. "There's a lot of muscle brains in Gryffindor," Harry said. "Idiots who believe I'm the chosen one and then keep antagonizing me over and over again." Hermione stared at him. "Do they think I won't remember?" Harry asked. "That I won't hold a grudge for years?" Harry crouched down next to Hermione and he said, "I'm going to learn that bald spell one day, and they'll regret teaching it to me." She giggled finally. "I might make all the male Gryffindors bald, just to be safe. We could get Neville a headband so he looks tough and kind of cool." "Headbands don't look cool," Hermione said, giving him a strange look. "Don't let Weasley push you into a loo while he and his friends get to enjoy a feast. You'll let him win then," Harry said. Hermione wiped her eyes. "We can't have that, can we?" Harry shoved the second roll in his mouth and threw the napkin in the trash. He offered her a hand up. Hermione took it and he pulled her to her feet. A blood-curdling scream from outside made them both freeze. Harry glanced at Hermione's frightened face before pulling out his wand. Despite everything that he'd been learning, he wouldn't stand a chance against an upper year, much less something worse, but it was all he had. They smelled it before they heard it, a stench that smelled like the worst locker-room stench, combined with a smell he'd only smelled when Vernon had gotten sick and spent 3 days in the lavatory. Hermione looked as though she was about to become sick, but Harry put a hand to her mouth. Movement from outside made Harry tense up. Something was coming closer. It sounded ponderous and shuffling. There was a deep-throated grunting noise. There was the sound of something dragging against the stone floor. From the sound, whatever it was too close for them to escape. Harry gestured to Hermione, and they hurriedly but quietly made their way toward one of the stalls. They stepped inside and carefully stepped up on the lid of the toilet. Both of them stopped breathing as they heard the labored breathing from outside the stall as something entered the lavatory. There was a sound of crashing as something seemed to be moving heavily around. Hermione stared at him, her face as white as a ghost. Her entire body was trembling, and she looked like she was about to faint. Harry grimaced and put his eye to the small gap between the stall door and the jamb, and he looked carefully outside. It was 12 feet tall, with skin that looked like granite. It stood on legs that looked like tree trunks, and it was staring at itself in the mirror, almost as though it didn't understand that it was looking at a reflection. It growled and smashed the mirror, and Hermione gave an involuntary tiny scream as her foot slipped into the toilet water. The creature whirled, and Harry knew he didn't have a choice. He exploded out of the stall and cast a stinging hex directly in the creature's eye. They'd covered trolls the week before in defense class, and Quirrell had been unusually thorough. Their hides were spell-resistant, and there wasn't much of a chance that he was going to be able to stop it. However, if he could lead it away from Hermione, he might have a chance of leading it toward one of the teachers. The stinging spell to the eye outraged the creature. It roared and smashed its way through the entrance to the lavatory. It hadn't noticed Hermione, and Harry found himself feeling glad. She hadn't had his experience in running away from things, and she wouldn't have had much of a chance against something like this. He ran down the hall, yelling at the top of his voice. This would serve the dual purpose of leading the troll away from Hermione and hopefully drawing the attention of professors. The troll lumbered after him. Harry felt good about his chances. As powerful as it was, it didn't have his speed or agility. He should be able to outpace it and maybe even squeeze into a place where it couldn't follow. He'd had experience in that sort of thing already. He really needed to explore Hogwarts more to see if there were good hiding places. He'd heard that a lot of old castles like this had secret passages. Finding some of them would make it easier to get around without being seen. Before he hid, though, he needed to draw the troll far enough away that it wouldn't circle back and get Hermione. Harry turned the corner, and before he could stop, he found his feet slipping out from beneath him. He lay stunned for a moment, and it took another moment to realize that he was laying in a massive pool of blood. Glancing to his right, he stifled a scream as he saw the Hufflepuff prefect's body laying against the wall. Bones were showing, and blood was everywhere. Harry scrambled to get to his feet as the pounding of footsteps drew nearer. He was covered in blood, but that didn't matter as much as just getting away. His feet slipped in the blood, and he fell to one knee. By the time he managed to scramble to his feet, it was too late. The troll stood over him, its face a mask of rage. Before Harry could do anything, he saw the club rise and fall toward him. His world exploded with a moment of pain. "Must be Slytherin!" Harry stared at the faces of the assorted students in front of him, and he felt the hat on his head. For a long moment he was confused, frozen as what had happened finally registered with him. His stomach heaved, and Harry threw the hat down and ran out of the great hall. As he was sick in one of the boys' lavatories, Harry could only think one thing. Crap. Thank you for listening, and I hope you enjoyed this chapter. We hope you consider joining our Patreon to help us keep reading stories like this one.